Hello, I'm Peter Gluckman. I think most of you know that I'm director of COI2, the Centre to Inform Futures, which is a transdisciplinary think tank focused on long-term issues based in the University of Auckland, but with members across New Zealand and internationally. I'm also president of the International Science Council, which is the global NGO representing science in the multilateral system, which is, its members are the social science associations, the national science unions, and the national academies from across the world. Our speaker today is Matthias Kaiser, who is chair of the International Science Council's working group on transdisciplinarity, and is here in Auckland at COI2 to finish off a major paper on various dimensions of transdisciplinarity, and most importantly, how it's actually to be applied in practice. And he's here to complete that paper, and he will be talking about that in his presentation today, which is entitled Transdisciplinarity, the Challenge for Responsible Science and Innovation. Matthias has been here before. He was here to do some early work with us on transdisciplinarity when COVID broke out. Instead of being here for a few weeks, he was here for several months working on these issues until he could get back to Bergen. He is just recently retired as director of the Centre for the Study of Sciences and Humanities at the University of Bergen in Norway. And his background is ideal to take a whole of science view of what transdisciplinarity is and how it could be used in the real world. He trained originally in mathematics and in philosophy in Germany. He is an expert on technology assessment, having served as the director of the Norwegian National Commission for Research Ethics in Science and Technology. He's advised governments, parliaments, and scientific communities in many parts of the world. He works very deeply on post-normal science. Indeed, the Bergen Centre has been one of the leaders in thinking about post-normal science. And of course, post-normal science has a strong overlap with what we now think of as transdisciplinarity. His particular interests are in food ethics, the ethics of food systems, dealing with groups both in the global south and indigenous peoples such as the Sami in issues of food ethics, as well as in the broader aspects of how science and society, science and policy works together. He's a previous member of the Committee for the Freedom and Responsibility of ICSU's predecessors and so forth. Today, he's going to make a presentation on two components, and in between, we'll take Q&A, which will be moderated by Anne Bardsley, Deputy Director of COI2. And we'll ask you to put your questions in the chat, and Anne will convert them into in the Q&A, just because given the large number of people on the webinar. So Matthias, over to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for this kind introduction. And in particular, so thank you for your hospitality. As you said, this is not the first time I'm here in New Zealand, and that should indicate that I really like to come back here, that I like to work with you people around here. And so do I right now. It has been very enjoyable. Unfortunately, I'm already leaving next week again, and I hope to come back sometime in the future. But today I'm going to talk about this topic of mine, this transdisciplinarity, and I hope that I can move the discussions about this a little bit out of what I would sometimes call jargon. You know, transdisciplinarity has become a little bit of a jargon in scientific discourses, and give it some more concrete backing, but also asking the question in particular in the beginning, why bother about that at all? The challenge for responsible science and innovation. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to give you a little bit of a personal background. Why did I get interested in that issue? What brought me there? And this is maybe interesting for you as well here in New Zealand, but it has to do with what I did in Norway many years ago, actually in the early 1990s. And with that commission that Peter mentioned, we were to study how science was dealing with advice, particularly about risks and other issues that were relevant for policies. And what we decided is that we would do a what is called that you take given technology and you look back and how was that technology assessed in time? Were these assessments all wrong? Were they right? Were they helpful? And all of that. And that was particularly useful because this aquaculture or the fish farming of salmon was basically mostly a Norwegian invention, and it wasn't old. It started just around the 1970s. And this was done in the 1990s. So we had all the issues, all the papers available. We could even talk to all the actors and all of that. So what did they predict? And what did they recommend for policy? And this is how we wrote that study about salmon fish farming in Norway. For me, the most interesting results was that virtually all assessments that we read were dramatically wrong in all the predictions and in their guidance also to policy. They basically missed what one, in hindsight, of course, knew became the real problems of this aquaculture business. And so there were a lot of issues that they didn't consider at all, like fish health, ecology, feed, welfare, and so on. And just to mention an example, even in the early 1980s, there was the question put to these expert commissions, what kind of research, what kind of science do we need? And the answer was, oh, we have enough of the basic science, we don't need anything, we just need applied science from the engineers for the cages. What they did not see was that there was not a single fish veterinarian in Norway. And if you look at the committees, there were people that had nothing to do or that were not involved in, for example, animal health. Now, had they asked, for example, farmers, people from agriculture early on, what can be the most pressing problem in an intensive production, animal production like this? Every farmer who has chickens and so would have told them the number one problem is diseases. But that advice never came. So the fish diseases came in the middle of the 1980s, and there was no treatment, no veterinarians, nothing. What they did was they poured antibiotics by the bucket, actually, in the open water. And there were many other issues, and I can't go into that. But what I learned from this is that all these assessments were based on the wrong or on too narrow a conception of what is relevant expertise. And they all misjudged the complexity of the problems, that this issue of a certain food production was related to many other systemic issues, not only in regard to environment and law and, of course, economy, but also in regard to, for example, tourist industry and other things. So that was an eye-opener to say that. So what I'm looking at is science advice that helps policy. Now, when do we need that and who needs it actually? Well, Peter mentioned the pandemic. Of course, I think we have all realized that, of course, we need science advice when there is a certain kind of a shock that hits us. And that can be point disruptors like this pandemic, or it can be chronic slow burns like, well, the climate change, for example. These are some of the real pressing issues. But we need science advice also on other issues where we need to innovate our systems. We have to change our systems. That can be restructuring systems, for example, the food system that we have, which is in dire need of being restructured for many reasons. I'm not going into that here. Or we have new technologies like the salmon fish farming that I mentioned here, or nowadays self-driving cars or whatever. And we wonder, how can that be embedded in a social reality? Or we need to see there are issues in decision makers on all levels, but also from all kind of strands. It could be in politics, it could be administration, it could be industry, wherever. But this is where it is needed. Now, you can ask, yes, we need advice, maybe, but why science? What is so special about science? Why would we look for science to give advice to that? Well, I at least, and this can of course be discussed, I'm open for that, but I do think that there are certain features of what in science that sort of recommend themselves for that kind of advice. This is first of all because science has a relative independence. I'm not saying that it's totally independent. Nobody ever is. Nobody is totally neutral, but it's relatively independent most of the time from special sector interests. And also because science, whatever comes out of it, goes through some kind of a quality check, a quality reassurance from peers. There is a large community that checks it, particularly, I mean, you know all that from the scientific publications. It's called peer review. And there's adaptivity. Science is relatively quick to both gather new data about a certain situation and then work them into their understanding of reality. We saw this in the pandemic at least. And also because science in itself is not one view, it has many aspects, many disciplines, many views. And so even if some of them may turn out to, you know, have a certain limited perspective, this gets balanced in the multiplicity of it. So yes, okay, we can say we need science, but why? What is so difficult about that for policy advice? And this is my basic answer. Well, there are two basic issues that make it difficult. And that is, first of all, because the problems that we are dealing with are so-called wicked problems, and the reality that we have to face is inherently complex. So let me just say something about these terms. Wicked problems are problems that have no definite problem formulation. Actually, people may have different viewpoints how to formulate the problem. And also, it has no real stopping rule. We cannot say, oh, now we have answered the problem. We don't know when we have answered the problem of, let's say, climate change or so, right? So, and solutions are never really true or false. They are, you know, better or worse, perhaps. And they are always sort of related to other issues. They are never isolated, right? And in all these wicked problems, there are multiple stakeholders that have different agendas and so on. So this is about wicked problems that many people have realized that is a political reality. Now, and then about the world out there. Well, as scientists have discovered, the world is inherently complex, and that means it's not just complicated because there's many things to consider, but it's complex in a sense that gives us certain challenges. If you talk in scientific terms, you would say, for example, in the modeling, we will have to deal with non-linearity. That is, there are systems that don't behave in an obvious, straightforward sense. They can have multiple equilibria points. They can jump up and they come down. And scale and scope matters. And all of that makes it virtually impossible to come up with very good predictions. So, but we still need to understand these complex systems, okay? So this is the situation. And just to illustrate this for you a little bit, my example is always the food system. And scientists, as I said, sometimes they only focus on one aspect, let's say the food production, the farmer or whatever, or the consumer. That is more the social scientist or the economist. But of course, there is a value chain between them, right? And that is already quite complex. But and that is the food chain, but even that is embedded in other systems, like health system. All these things have to do with environmental health, with the health of the consumers and all of that. It has to do with the environment, sustainability issues. It has to do with society and values, what I call, for example, food identities, that you have certain traditions that are quite important to people, economy, of course, and politics and regulation. So, and all of these systems interact. So you can imagine that there is no simple way to do this. So, and this is what also post-normal science that Peter mentioned in the introduction recognized already early, or the late 80s and the early, and the early 90s, basically is saying that when we deal with science for policy, we always have questions where the stakes are high and the facts are uncertain. A lot of them facts are disputed. The values are in dispute. There are different viewpoints about what we should count the most. And still decisions are urgent. And in that situation, we need to look on the uncertainties that are in there. We have to assess knowledge quality. And the notion of expertise has to be widened, which is basically what I said in my introduction about the salmon fish farming. So these were two of the inspirations, and add to this a third one, inspirations that gave rise to a now intensive discussion about transdisciplinarity. The third one is called, but it's going back to a book saying the new production of knowledge, came out in the early 90s, 1994. And they said there is, on the one hand, scientific activities that is based in normal departments and in the discipline, the traditional normal science, as Thomas Kuhn called it. But on the other hand, one has seen, at least since the 60s and 70s, what they call mode 2 science. All of a sudden, there is a political priority to say, oh, we have to attack that problem, the fight against cancer, for example, right? And nowadays, of course, climate change. And one has new institutes coming up that are dedicated to that, or that are dedicated to, say, biodiversity, what have you. So, and there, the problems are from the outside. They are not scientifically generated. It's not even sure that they have purely scientific answers, but these institutes have to work on that, and that they called mode 2 science. And they said, this is what is transdisciplinary. All the problems are there from society, and now it's put on your table, and they say, do something with it. And they call this transdisciplinary. Now, okay, and I said, these things already happened a long time ago. But what is the reality? What is the academic reality? And now I guess many of you will be, of you that are joining this, are maybe academics or have an academic training. And the reality, I put that as a hypothesis. You can correct me if the situation is very different here in New Zealand, but I would say the reality is that it is very difficult for scientists to break through the disciplinary boundaries. The more they try, the more difficult it becomes. The academic system does not reward that kind of activity that I was roughly describing in the introduction as transdisciplinary. So, but that is what is needed. If these problems are there, the wicked problems, and if they are inherently complex, and we need that science advice on many issues, like what we nowadays also call the grand societal issues, right? I won't list them, but then at least some of us need to break through these disciplinary silos, okay? So this is what we need to do. Now, okay, how is the reality? Now, I'm talking from a Norwegian European perspective. I followed European framework programs and all of that. And you can see what in the beginning was clearly disciplinary focus for particularly also applied science has moved stage by stage to what was on the first stage multidisciplinary research. He said, oh yes, there are different people, different disciplines that have to work on that. But then one realized that is not good enough. They have to be coordinated. And then one was calling for interdisciplinary research. At my university in Bergen, there's also this encouragement, they call it, to do interdisciplinary work, which very often just means that a different department within the science faculty or within the medical faculty, that different departments work together. And for example, what we call a radical interdisciplinary is still very seldom and very difficult to achieve. So many universities still have troubles coming to that level of interdisciplinary research, particularly crossing different faculties and going over to the social sciences and humanities and law. But that is not enough. We need to do something more, and that is what I'm going to say in a minute. We need to do transdisciplinary science. While I say that, while I'm going to argue for that, I just want to make one thing clear. That is not to replace the disciplinary, normal kind of research that goes on, or the basic science research that goes on in the departments. We still need that. We still need the basic research. It's an invaluable component. What I'm saying here is we need to go beyond that with something more. We need more than that. At the same time, we need to keep our disciplinary integrity. We need to sort of use the highest quality of our insights from our training for that kind of work. Okay, so this is where we want to move to transdisciplinary science. What does that mean now for the scientists? Well, first of all, there is the recognition that scientists do have different roles. Sometimes, and we can just be pure scientists doing the basic science that we've talked about. We can be an issue advocate. We can maybe promote specific agendas, for example, on biodiversity, to say that, oh, we have to take care of the sharks that are threatened or something like that. Or we can advise policy, and typically there is this notion that came around honest broker. And actually, Peter and I, we published a paper on the brokerage role. Anyway, so the important thing here is that as scientists, we can have different roles. It's just that we need to be very clear on what role we are taking. And this is the major thing. So this was one of the consequences. The other thing is, there is too much ideology, and there is sometimes, the fight of saying that, oh yeah, but science has a special privilege when it comes to finding the truth about the world. I think once we start the work about transdisciplinarity, we have to cut out all this talk about the final truths. Of course, we don't want falsities in this, but we want knowledge that is fit for purpose. We have a certain goal, we have a certain purpose. We want to, for example, clean up the waters in a certain bay or something, or revise our educational primary school system, something like that. So what we need to do is we need to think of high quality knowledge that is fit for that purpose. So avoid ideology, look at what works for that purpose. And don't even think about, starting battles of who is right or who is wrong, or handing out blame that is because of that party we now have this problem. Look at the problem afresh and see what one can find in terms of robust solution over time. Another thing we need to realize is that facts and values will always, in this area, be intertwined. There will be different perspectives on reality. There will even be different, what I call value landscape. That is, people that are guided by very different values, not totally different, but in some areas they may be quite different. And there may be different knowledge systems that we have to utilize. I mean, one of the most obvious knowledge system for all of us is, of course, our own personal experience, right? I mean, we bring that into solving or looking at a certain problem. But there is also more socially embedded knowledge systems, like here in New Zealand, in other places like in Norway, indigenous knowledge systems. In Norway, it's the Sami, here you have the Maori. And that all will result in a multiplicity of perspectives and methods that we have to use. We have to utilize all them and not narrow it artificially down. So one of the most important things in transdisciplinarity is what I call reflexivity. That is, we all, wherever we are and how hard we try, we always have a certain bias with us. We have a biased perspective on reality. As I said, our own experience always comes in. And that already gives us very often a certain bias, right? When talking about education in general, we cannot avoid thinking about maybe our own children or my own childhood or something like that. Now, and all the actors in transdisciplinary research will bring some kind of bias in. And we need to do that. We need to recognize that. We cannot sort of get rid of all the bias. We have to acknowledge that and make that explicit. And maybe sometimes correct it a little bit, but see the things also in the light of others. So in a basic sense, we need to recognize the bias and seek compromise. Sometimes we can find consensus even, but that is not given, but at least we can seek compromise. And as I said, with the post-normal science perspective, one of the most important things is to not fall for the temptation to just bring out what we positively have learned about reality in our studies, like, you know, the positive knowledge. But we also have to be very clear about what we still do not understand, the mapping the uncertainties. And there are actually, even in the sciences, there are more advanced methods to do that than just statistical uncertainty, technical uncertainties. In any case, what I want to say is these uncertainties for the decision-making count often as much as what we positively know, the certainties, okay? So this is another consequence in transdisciplinary science. And now this is maybe the most important part. In transdisciplinary research, we need to engage with partners from all walks of life, partners that are affected parties somehow, that take an active interest in the issue that we are dealing with. Now, some scientists may say, oh, we have always done that. We have always had some workshops where we presented our views to stakeholders and then they could comment and then we went back to that. Well, this is what in this famous letter of participation, Sherry Arnstein told tokenism. We can have a consultation, yes, but it's still, we would be in power of the final result. So what we want to aim at in transdisciplinary research is a partnership, that we generate the knowledge together and that we assess the knowledge together. So this is the least level of empowerment that we envisage in transdisciplinary research. Sometimes we may move up to delegated power, where we maybe have a local issue that, you know, these people can arrange and manage. It's not typically not in our part of the world coming up to citizen control. That would be more like a Swiss model of direct democracy. But partnership is definitely one where we would try to empower the partners. And then there is another issue that I want to mention. What is another consequence of that transdisciplinary science? It comes in all phases of research. The most important one is already the very first one. It's the framing of the issue. What kind of problems are there that we need to address? How do we formulate them? How can we go about them? And then we plan an issue of how do we research that and who is doing that? And we can do this in multiple ways, right? As different sources of knowledge. And then we do the research, maybe separately, but in any case, we have to assess the quality again all together and monitor the use of that knowledge and of these results. So transdisciplinarity comes in all phases of research. And when we have described transdisciplinarity in that sense, we also will see that it actually integrates many of those terms that are around now in science funding. You can talk about citizen science, for example. Yes, this is very much citizen science, but citizens not only as those who supply the data, but citizens' involvement also in the sense that they actually engage in the research as well. It's participatory action research. This is very similar. It's responsible research and innovation. And it's definitely about also sustainability. So, and we have to include indigenous and other knowledge systems. So these things have a lot of overlap. It's not identical, but a lot of overlap with transdisciplinarity and that topic. So just to summarize that, where I am, transdisciplinarity as a program has many features. It's always about complex societal issues, wicked problems, and we seek to have partnerships there with stakeholders, civil society in general, and we are looking for answers that can be fit for purpose and that will respect the different value landscapes that are in society. We will have a multi-actor approach, as I said. And on all of that, of course, we need to look at what the social sciences and the humanities have to contribute. And that includes even non-empirical disciplines like law, like philosophy, and others. But we also include extra scientific belief systems, other belief systems, or knowledge systems. And one of the major issues that I haven't mentioned yet is that one of the first targets we have to overcome in this research is to develop a common language so that these different groups can actually form these partnerships. And on that basis also reflect on their bias and self-reflection. So I will stop here to open up for Q&A, if that is possible. I think it will. So, and Anne will probably.
Well, we don't have any.
Okay, go ahead, Anne.
Thanks, Matthias. We don't have any questions in the chat yet, but I have a previous question about that, you're presenting science somewhat simplistically in that there's actually a huge range from sheer discovery to data collection and observation. And the question is how can transdisciplinary science affect those activities of discovery, and is it going to be only useful in these wicked problems? Clarifying that it might not cover the whole vast range of scientific endeavor. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, I want to sort of distance myself from a claim that would say, oh, transdisciplinary science will change all of the scientific practices and all of it. It will not. We still need to, do what we sometimes call reductionist basic science in many areas. However, and then transdisciplinary science for policy. However, I think once we start that activity, there will be problems that are coming back to basic science that are then in need of further elaboration. And as a part of transdisciplinary projects, we will actually have to include maybe a lot of these problems in the basic sciences. It's just not that that we can say that there is a very clear dominance there. Transdisciplinary science will not take over all of the science, and the basic science will still have their own problems to deal with, but there will be interaction. Basic science will be integrated and will be affected by other problems or by new problems that come up in these projects.
Okay, I do have another, there's a couple of questions coming into the chat now, in fact, quite a few. We have a question around the roles of researchers and research organizations in transdisciplinary programs. This experience is that, our experience is that it is not only about the researchers' different roles, as in honest broker, etc., but also having others within the team with non-research but valuable skills, including communications, designers, facilitation, etc. Your comments?
Yes, and I will actually, this is part of part 2, because there are a lot of difficulties in implementing these ideas. And one of the difficulties is just what this person was referring to. I mean, we may recognize the need that we have other type of professions, other type of insights represented in there. Communication is one. And it is not easy to integrate that. There is maybe no funding for that. There is maybe no clear definition in the roles that are assigned in projects like that. So we need to think in new terms. We need to rethink funding. We need to rethink institutional frameworks. I will come back to that, and I hope in the second part.
Yeah. I know that a lot of these questions are you're about to answer in your next session. I'll ask one more. What is needed for our universities to change the reward systems to enable participatory action research? This is particularly difficult in health research, where the randomized controlled trial and meta-analyses are considered the gold standard. I ask because as an action researcher, I find it terribly hard to get published in top journals because of the weaknesses you talk about.
Yes, yes. Well, this is just, basically, this is a confirmation of what I'm going to say. This is, there is an ideal, there is a recognition of what we need to do, but breaking out of these disciplinary silos or constraints is very difficult. And one of the things is that you are not rewarded. If you are hired in a university and you engage in that kind of project and you have results, well, where do you publish it? And if you get it published, do the publications count as much as other disciplinary publications, and all of these issues? So what does it take to have a different system of quality assessment of individuals, right? Well, definitely we have to think in other terms, in maybe more qualitative assessments, but what exactly is an open question, and I hope we can come back to that. I agree with you that right now there's a difficulty, even finding journals. I'm myself also editing a journal on food ethics, which is supposed to be interdisciplinary, but I find that many people have reservations because they say, yes, but it's not within my subject, so maybe it's not recognized. So even publishers are reluctant to come up with journals that are truly open for transdisciplinary research.
I have a question from Mimi. You spoke about finding a common language as an obstacle, but an even bigger obstacle, in my opinion, is achieving transdisciplinarity. In achieving transdisciplinarity are the pre-existing power dynamics that may restrict the actors or the knowledge systems that are incorporated to address societal problems. And how do you propose to address these power imbalances and biases?
I think that's a very important observation. I mean, yes, the language barriers is important, but as Mimi Lam is saying here, there are power imbalances. That is, you come to let's say to a place, you come to a community, and there are already both economical powers involved, there are political powers involved, and maybe there are also strong traditions that are, you know, sort of taken care of by certain groups and others. And so how do you break through all of that if you want to, you know, stick to the issues that are really troubling for the members of that community? And well, I don't think there is a general answer to that problem. It's just that you start all of these transdisciplinary projects need a long phase for starting it up and getting the people around the table, the right people around the table, and developing the right language. And you have to be sensitive about these power dynamics, and you have to intervene with that. I had a project in Bangladesh with other people in very far remote parts where, of course, one of the power dynamics was between people who were religious leaders and others, and between men and women. So we slowly had to introduce a, you know, demand that women should be at the table, and that also the religious leaders would not necessarily get the right to speak in all occasions. So, and that was after a while accepted, but it needs a long time. So I can only say to Mimi, you have to be very patient, and you have to formulate them, put them on the table, and try to work around them.
I think we'll let you carry on with the rest of your talk, Matthias, because I think you will answer some of these questions, and we'll get back to them if you haven't.
I will talk about the difficulties in this now, and some of the questions have already shown that. I think a lot of the problems that come in is because we have all these different values that we sort of have in the back of our head, and we try to shelter. And some of them are maybe the academic values or epistemic values. Some of them are values that have to do with our traditions, social traditions, religious traditions, and others. And all of these, and many of these values are protective. They are protective of a certain structure where we believe, oh, this structure had taken care of that kind of value perspective. And it's very difficult to move beyond that when you meet other kind of value structures and also knowledge structures, right? So, and that makes it really difficult. And just think about, you know, these different actors in what we call now the transdisciplinary research. So I think the major issue is here about really crossing different value landscapes. But let's see how that works. How do we assess what is good transdisciplinary research? This is quality assessment of the knowledge, of the products, of what comes out of the kind of research that I was describing in the first part. Now, if you would be working in a scientific discipline, in a subdiscipline, be it in humanities or be it in biology or something, you have a problem, you collect your data, you analyze them maybe with a model, and you find a possible solution that we can test and others will test. And then you say, oh yeah, and then you publish it. And then it goes through peer research. And the peers then say, oh, that's good enough. Yes, it's obviously highly relevant and very well informed. That is a quality assessment in the sciences that we feel has been working to a certain extent. We know it's not perfect, but it has been working to a certain extent. We feel it is threatened now through internet, through pre-publications and other things, we all of a sudden see that these structures are threatened, and many people get protective of that. And that is also why, you know, in assessing, for example, researchers or research projects, many people have a tendency to just say, okay, let's stick to the biometrical data, and then we have at least something that is concrete. All other things are more, well, fluid or vague. So what we do know about this is, when we do look at transdisciplinary research and want to assess it, then those criteria that we had, those, you know, publication output criteria, the biometrical data and all of that. So that is not enough. It will not do. And it's not even sure that we need to have, for example, peer-reviewed publications or a number of them, or a high number of them, right? If we have something that is available to the users and to the decision makers, and that is useful for them, maybe that is much better than having it published in Science or Nature or somewhere else. So that is definitely an issue. And also the project lifetime. After a certain period of years, you normally are expected to be done with a certain project. It's, well, there are some very long-term projects, but whatever, in astronomy or others. But as an individual researcher, you have to do your project in 2, 3 years, sometimes in 4. But I think transdisciplinary research would need at least 5 years, because it needs already 1.5 years to just get started, to get the basics in place and to find maybe all the relevant stakeholders. Maybe it needs 2 years for that. So what we realize is we need to look for other criteria, for other quality criteria. And that is basically, you know, checking for all these features that I've mentioned earlier that makes the transdisciplinary research. And that must be a qualitative assessment. What is not necessary or good enough as a quality assessment is whether or not the results of a project are actually adopted in practice. We know this from, for example, technology assessment, or for parliaments or policy advice, that we can have a very good advice, a very scientifically well-based advice to a decision maker, and then the decision maker makes a decision that is quite opposite. And that is legitimate, because that is a final assessment based on the values of the decision makers, which typically is an elected body like a parliament or something. Or it is a company that follows its own rules and can do so. But the adoption of your results is not a criteria for success or quality in it. At least not necessarily so. But in order to do that, we need funders who are willing to do what? Well, we need funders that include value considerations, social science and humanities, or already what we call upstream. Upstream is, of course, opposite to downstream. Downstream is the typical tendency that we had like 15 years ago, where you would come up with a project, let's say in medicine, and then after you have done your research, you said, oh, how would that be taken up by the patients or by the users? So that you produce a result first or a technology first, and then ask the question about its, you know, its value on something. That is a downstream. What we need to do is we need to go in here, and for example, also in the innovation processes, and we need to ask these questions already at the very beginning. So the social science and humanities and the ethics and all of it come in upstream. And that is particularly relevant when we go to the sustainable development goals here, that they are formulated as, you know, overall goals of our policies. We need to look at them and say, hey, we need to be very much aware about where we go, where we want to go with our, for example, food system, which is, I don't remember, somewhere here. Anyway, doesn't matter. So we need also funders who recognize the inherent complexity of all these sustainability goals. We know that it's very easy to write about them and say, oh yes, we need to promote these goals. But if you break them down, there are sub-goals under each of them, many of them. And even they are very complicated, and they are all interwoven with each other. And so we have this inherent complexity, and a complexity that the funders also need to realize is not opening up for sort of a silver bullet answer that comes top down, but a complexity that needs to start bottom up. And that needs to say that, hey, we have to find our own solutions, our own, let's say, sustainable food, our own food identities and all of this from bottom up that contributes to these larger goals. We need funders who are planning for multi-phase long-term projects. As I said, we need projects that are assessed after maybe 2 years already, and then say, oh yes, you have managed actually to mobilize all these stakeholders. Now you can start to do real good research. And now we come into the next phase, and we give you more money for that, and we grow or we increase the funding. So this is the next point. Allow for incremental funding and expect intermediate outputs for follow-up. And then we also have to think that the funding is not necessarily only going to academic actors anymore, as it has been in for many years, but we need to fund other groups. For example, NGOs need to be part of it. And not only industries are typically also have been funded, but we need to fund other actors that become relevant in this group in order to do this work. I mentioned indigenous communities, but that can also be other kind of groups, youth groups, schools, and others. And we need scientists who are capable of seeing an issue in a full complexity and within a social embedding. Now, I can just tell you that we all make different experiences in this. My experience is that, and as Peter was saying, I'm coming from mathematics and philosophy of science. My experience was that the natural sciences, or many of the natural scientists, have been very open to recognize the social complexity of their activities. And they have been looking out for partners from, for example, the social sciences. Whereas often the social scientists have been much more closed and hard to move out of their standard theorizing to meet the demands from the natural sciences very often. Because you basically have to start with a clean slate. You have to start with, say, okay, we want to contribute and we want all of us now to look at this with an open mind. And we are not going to prove this or that theory. This is not necessarily our starting point. We will see what will be relevant. So thus opening your mind and to see the complexity of the issues, and that they may demand of you that you have to open up quite a bit more than you are used to in your discipline. That is a challenge. And some scientists so far have been open, I think, but some are still very hard to move out of their disciplines. So also we need scientists that have an open eye for what is out there in society, scoping and search for all relevant stakeholders. That basically means that we have to participate, that we have to follow what is going on. As I said, one of the examples, let's say aquaculture again. you know, we need to see, okay, how is it going? I was in Coromandel last week and see their mussels farming, oyster farming, and how is that embedded in a community? What are the conflicts? How is the community thinking about it? How is it recruited? How is it changing? Who are the owners? How is it employing other? And for all of these things to see, it takes a lot of effort, actually, even for scientists to scope all these issues in order to plan such a research. And then we need to actually engage these stakeholders in the design of the project, which is called co-design, basically, right? So how is that going to work, particularly when we just have an idea and we are not funded yet? We have to design a proposal first, right? So we have to spend time and sometimes money, travel also, to engage with these stakeholders, and they have to do the same, right? That is a matter of also communication. We need to communicate what we are aiming at in a way that is picked up by stakeholders, so that they see that it's relevant, that they can see that it is not our agenda as a scientist or whatever we are, but actually trying to solve problems that are relevant for them, and proposing an equal partnership. So all of these things are not easy to do. And we need to build mechanisms for what I said, reflexivity, which is maybe the greatest challenge in the long run. But again, we need to do this. And all of this, we are in a university. This, by the way, is a picture of what I took you of the University of Bergen. We need universities which are adjusting their criteria for assessing academic merits. So you don't want to be stuck as an maybe associate professor for many, many years, because you don't have enough publications within your discipline and only have projects or only within transdisciplinary research. So, and you have engaged with stakeholders. So how do universities assess that? Is it counted or not? You have to answer that yourself. I think it is difficult in many universities, and including mine, or that is University of Bergen, okay? So the next question then the universities have to ask themselves is, how do we actually prepare the ground for transdisciplinary projects? One thing is that we need to actually provide fora where we get to interdisciplinary communication in the university. And what I have proposed for a long time, which we never realized so far, is that we have regular meetings between on topics where we just have from all faculties discuss a certain topic and see how that is, seen from a certain discipline, and get people from all these different disciplines together, that we have a certain regularity for these interdisciplinary communication fora. We don't have that. At best, we have it in the faculties, but not across faculties. And we need to do all of that without neglecting or basic science, or saying that the basic scientists feel themselves neglected in these policies. And then the larger issue over time will be, how do we actually recruit people into that? How do we actually train people to be ready for that kind of thing? I think for the time being, all of us need to think about this, of learning about it. But eventually we want to have young people that can come in here with a lot of expertise. How do we do that? How do we select them? We're not proposing to change university education from the first level onwards towards transdisciplinary research, but we're basically saying that from a certain level on, we need to have these young, promising people in a kind of an apprenticeship in those transdisciplinary projects. And we need to engage in what is called problem-based learning for that kind of area. And it is not sure that we in a university are ready for that. So far, in our university, I see that the questions or the issues between the faculties make it very difficult to come to these kind of models, to this kind of activities, because it always comes down to money that is then owned by these faculties, and they want to spend on their own, or even departments on their own activities. So what I think we are facing here is that we need some kind of an institutional change. We need novel governance, and not only in the research institutions, but maybe also in our other social institutions. We are aiming at what is called deliberative democracy. We want to engage citizens in societal change, in transformative change, and our institutions that we need to mobilize are not quite ready for that. We need some institutional change, and I'm not saying that I have the answer for how this is going to be, but that much we can see. Also, another thing we need is outreach and communication, because yes, has a certain, and we are not necessarily viewed as a natural partner in this development. Industry may be skeptical towards certain parts of the sciences that we have, very often towards the social sciences, except maybe the economy. So industry is, but also civil society, is quite skeptical about all these, what they say, oh, these experts tell us this and that, but they don't consider other things. We have seen these things coming up during the pandemic, where they say, oh yes, the experts all want us to, have lockdowns and all of that, but they forgot the education of our young children, and that how much they suffer. So, and that was all reflected in a criticism of science. And there is a lot of criticism of science, as long as it is secluded, as it's disciplinary science. So we need to have an outreach where we promote science as a possible partner, as an equal partner in societal transformations. And that, I think, is a communication task that we, of course, can do institutionally, but we maybe have to do this also very much individually. I think I want to stop here. It is still enough time for questions and communications, or questions and comments. So thank you very much for your attention so far.
Great. Thank you, Matthias. That was great. And apologies, there was at least one little silent period. I'm going to blame the university Wi-Fi. I don't know that we have any additional questions in the chat, but I have several or a few that came from previously. But basically, I want to just reiterate what you're saying is that we need a new set of metrics for this type of work, and this relates to people's questions previously, how we get the university to recognize this kind of work. And those different metrics need to take into account not just things like different types of publication outcomes, but also these longer timelines. And I'm glad you mentioned deliberative democracy at the end there. It's something that's dear to our heart here at KOI2. And I feel like that's maybe a way, on your point, that uptake of these recommendations or whatever by decision makers is not necessarily part of the metrics of success of the transdisciplinary work, but that those kind of processes, deliberative processes that engage the public, in questions where the science and values intersect, and you can maybe build towards consensus, could potentially push decision makers towards accepting those. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, you may not, it's not surprising. I'm very much agreeing with you on many of these issues. But this issue of deliberate democracy, I'm very conscious about, and I wanted to mention this because I think this whole move, when we talk about transdisciplinarity, is actually one way to realize our ideals about deliberative democracy. And one of the ideals is that we actually we blow more life into our societies by engaging the citizens more than we normally do through voting and other things, or yes, but actually in informing our, or in preparing our present society, but also our future visions of the society. And I think that is something that is very close to the heart of people. I just briefly want to say that I have had many experiences with people that were engaged, I mean, citizens or stakeholders and others. And one of the things that I realized is, if you come to them and say, what you contribute now to this question will end up in a forum where it has at least a high potential of influence, then these people say, I would love to contribute. I would love to be part of the political decision-making process. Some people told me, I've always wished to be part of it. Say, they want to contribute their experiences, their views, because they feel these are often drowned in others. So yes, and transdisciplinarity, I see as one mechanism to make that happen. I don't know if that answered your question, but assessment is difficult, I agree, and that needs a lot of other criteria there. Yeah.
Right. We have a question from Barrett in the chat. You mentioned the importance of fostering regular discussions across faculties and disciplines. Do you see, for example, the library as a place or an actor that could facilitate these as a central source? And also, second part of the question is, in your experience, what kind of outreach and communications are most effective in reaching possible partners? And where should we be focusing our efforts in upskilling in that space?
I think, and again, I cannot give universal answers or answers that apply to all the places. This is very much my experience. University libraries are exceptionally well suited for that kind of discussion. We have had some of them that were initiated by the university libraries, for example, about what we can say scientific integrity and authorship issues, right? And our university library, together with institutes and others, then arranged several discussions of that. And these places were always viewed as sort of neutral meeting places between faculties. So I think there is definitely a call for university libraries to not only supply, well, the data and the reading material, but actually supply the forum for that kind of discussion and initiate it also in a way. And the second question was to do with, what was it now again?
What kinds of outreach and communication are the most effective in reaching possible partners?
Yes, I think there is no universal answer to that, other than that you have to watch your language. You have to not, I mean, speak scientific jargon all the time. And you have to actually build upon an understanding of, well, the problems that the partners have that you want to reach. Basically, I think a lot of that will, given that many of these issues will be local or regional or something like that, or will have local representatives, a lot of these things will be depending upon personal appearances. That is, actually making the effort of going there and maybe speaking with them, or in some kind of thing. So, and that is one of the major things. Of course, then the new way of doing it is, of course, also the social media and all of that. But I think in actually engaging other people, it takes more. It takes personal commitment, and you have to show this, I think, in being present when things happen in the shadow.
I think it's part of that upskilling of just that awareness of who the stakeholders are. And I know just from experience that this takes a while to build that up so it becomes sort of second nature. Well, in this question, we need to think about these partners. It's part of that whole training and how you train, and not everyone will be suited to that type of work either, as brokers moving even more towards that knowledge brokerage space. But I mean, it's something that I know can happen earlier than universities. It's not necessarily, you can start training in secondary schools, and there's programs that I know of doing that here to start people thinking in this way. Yeah, let me see. I think there's another question. I was intrigued by your concern that natural scientists have been open to working across disciplines, but social scientists less so. And I wonder if there are aspects here relating to who we hear from and what we hear. I worry about the power dynamics involved, especially including in academia. Might you be able to discuss this further?
Now, what do you say in English? That can be a can of worms. I'm honest about this, and that is why I said that. And I want to say this with this proviso. This is my personal experience, that I found it very often easy to speak to or with natural scientists. I found also very often that natural scientists contacted me and say, hey, you are a philosopher. You know, we need to think about whatever environmental justice or whatever these issues, ethical issues, right? Now, when it comes to social scientists, I must also say there are, of course, general exceptions, but I found that they have been much more struggling with both with funding and other issues, where they felt to justify their disciplinary approach, which made them more locked into their boundaries, right? So, and maybe that is the explanation. Maybe they have been so tightly funded that they didn't have the ability to, you know, go out and really speak with others about some of these problems. But I felt that very often when I talked to them, they had, oh yes, I have my theory here, and I can use that theory then to do this and that. But it's hardly been the case that they would just open up and say, oh yeah, I have no idea how that is, but let's see. We talk to them and we go and we arrange some meetings and have an open mind. So I think they were much more, you know, stressed within their disciplinary silos than the natural science. Of one reason or other, I don't know. Maybe it's because of the funding situation, but there can be other reasons as well.
Do you have any comments on the relative contribution of changes in funding and assessment systems versus scientists changing their mindset to enhance this transdisciplinary research? Do you see, I mean, both need to happen clearly, but do you see one over the other?
Well, I think the funding is always setting a certain signal. that when the funding is there, many of the scientists can follow and say, okay, now I can do this. So fundings set an important signal to, what is prioritized for future developments. In Europe, where I've been part, the European Commission has been quite active and has been also in the direction of setting new priorities for research, and both in the Horizon, now it's Horizon Europe framework and earlier frameworks, but also in the so-called ERC, European Research Council issues. They have actually taken in some of these challenges. At the same time, they have always been struggling between industrial interests in certain issues that are promoting certain topics and these new ways of doing it. We know that the European Union has now a big stress on open science, among others, right? And they have for a long time expected interdisciplinary research projects. And they have for a long time expected also participatory activities in the research project, user involvement and all of that. So they have been moving in that direction. And that has set signals to national research fundings again. So the national research funding in Europe has often followed that kind of model. And once that is done, I think then also researchers have moved in these directions. It takes a lot of idealism to go in for these kind of transdisciplinary projects without having the possibility of funding somewhere at the horizon, right? So I think that is absolutely necessary that we press our funding institutions. And that is not only public funding, that can also be other fundings, right? From private or industrial funding even. But that we press them to open up for that kind of project.
There was a question from previous on that topic. How does industry funding being used nefariously potentially influence these arguments? If you're talking about, we are talking about real world problems and you're talking about industry funding, does that have an influence?
Partially, but again, I don't think there is a general answer on that, because there's, in my experience, in these fields, there have been all kinds of different influences. As I said, I'm working a lot in food ethics, and I've seen that some of the very big actors in the food industry are engaged in what we would say new innovation that is absolutely having the promise of sustainable development and all of that, right? So they are already exploring markets, and they are helping research institutes actually to promote that. Of course, they do this also with the view that they might earn money with it. Industry must earn money, of course. And that has been, and in some parts, that is quite helpful. On the other hand, the same industry can stop certain other issues from happening. I don't think that, for example, in the food sector, many of the influences that come from industry have been pointing in the direction of let the big actors get together and work it out. They have not been going in the direction of sort of bottom-up actors. And that includes alliances with, let's say, the FAO or other big policy units. So big industry often has had the issue that they want, yeah, we want sustainability, we want all that, but we want also to be some of the defining elements for what goes under it. And that kind of openness, what we would have in transdisciplinary research, has been difficult, at least in this sector. So it goes both ways. And you can manage to have industry involved when you have certain activities that are innovative and that have a promise, and then yes, get them involved. But sometimes you have to press the issue that it needs to be bottom up as well, and that is not always easy to swallow for industrial funding.
Thank you. I want to note that there are a couple of links that people have put into the chat, which look like interesting toolkits that I encourage people to check out. I also wanted to bring Peter back now. I'm sure he has something to say to wrap this session up. Thanks.
I'd just like to, first of all, thank Matthias for a splendid presentation, which reflects a lot of experience in this area over many years, and which I think is coming to the hard point. I think nobody doubts the need for this type of research, but it does require substantive change in funding systems. It needs critical changes within the universities and other employers of scientists, because traditional modes of assessment for tenure, for promotion, just do not work, and disadvantage scientists from actually, or academics from engaging in this field. And there's also the issue of how to evaluate the product, because the product will often not be a peer-reviewed publication, and often the product has a very complex set of outputs in terms of relationship development, reports, changed attitudes, and so forth. And I chair the review, the Kund of the PBRF, the review in the UK of it at the moment. And one of the things we're struggling with very much at the moment is, given what this is, which is a significant shift in how some science is undertaken, how universities will actually have to change, how funders will have to change, how academies will have to change. It's got very many dimensions. And that's why the ISC, led by, asked Matthias to lead some work, which hopefully we'll finish in the first quarter of next year, which is to try and produce not just a theoretical discussion on what transdisciplinarity is, how it relates to other forms of knowledge and so forth, but actually to try and raise the questions which need to be addressed if transdisciplinarity is to meet its promise, namely how funders need to think about distinct funding mechanisms, how institutions need to think about the people that they employ and how they assess their performance, and how do you actually assess after the exercise whether it's been a good job done or not. So I encourage you to continue. KOI2, the Centre of Informed Futures, is deeply involved in all these aspects of this issue. In fact, that's one of the core reasons we were set up as a think tank to think about these kinds of issues. And I'm grateful that Matthias, having spent an unintendedly long time here in 2020, leaving his bass guitar behind with me for several months, well, now it turned out for 18 years, has come back to reclaim his guitar, but also to work with us on completing this report. So thank you, Matthias, and both he and the KOI2 remain engaged in this product and happy to correspond on it further. Thank you very much.